Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Erica Cruzel, and I'm a manager with CGI. This session, Environmental Justice, Financial Recovery, and Rural Communities, is part of CGI's broader inclusive economic recovery programming and aims to bring together cross-sector organizations to discuss, elevate, and hopefully scale the impactful work already being done, and create convening spaces to foster collaboration and partnerships to further this work and achieve an inclusive, equitable recovery. Today, you'll hear from various community and CDFI leaders sharing more about the impact of CDFIs and how this group can come together to support this critical work. Before I hand it over to the moderator for today, I just want to encourage participants to ask questions through the Q&A, and if we have time, we will answer a few at the end of the panel. As some of you might have heard, President Clinton today announced that we'll be officially launching an action network on inclusive economic recovery this spring, aimed at convening organizations together to create partnerships and collaborations to address the racial disparities in America in order to build an inclusive economic recovery. I look forward to finding the ways this group can push this work forward. The CGI team and I are available to foster any connections that support your work. If anyone would like to get connected to our panelists, please contact me and I'd be happy to put you in touch with one another. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our moderator, Keith Benson, President of Coastal Enterprises, Inc., who will take over for the rest of the session. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you, Erica, and hello, everyone out there. Thank you for joining us today. It's a real honor for me to moderate this session on environmental justice, financial recovery, and rural communities. As Erica said, my name is Keith Benson, and I'm president of Coastal Enterprises Incorporated. We're a Maine-based CDFI that combines business and industry expertise and policy solutions to support, and financing to support the creation of good quality jobs, environmentally sustainable enterprises, and more broadly shared prosperity. Our roots organizationally are in the civil rights movement and grew from there to organizing and supporting rural businesses, initially largely in Maine's natural resource businesses of farming, fishing, and forestry. So this topic has a lot of relevance and resonance with us, and so I'm really excited to be here today. The rural people in many of those industries were often, and many still are, disconnected from markets and basic resources to start or grow their businesses. It was clear early on that the future of those industries depended on sustainable use of Maine's natural resources, and we've been on a journey ever since to determine how best to support these industries and their sustainability. And increasingly, we're also involved in many ways with clean energy and solar investment here in the state of Maine. And I'm very excited for this session, where we're going to be talking about the important roles that CDFIs can play, working closely with businesses and others to address not only operational, but also workforce challenges and environmental challenges as well. As many of you know, there's 1,100 mostly place-based CDFIs across the country. CDFIs are unique because they can really tailor their services to the needs of their communities. We see great opportunity to really provide greater access to capital and technical assistance through investment for rural and agricultural businesses and clean energy businesses across the spectrum and across this country. And so I'll be introducing our panelists in a moment, but I'll now introduce Mayor Libby Schaaf from the beautiful city of Oakland. Mayor Schaaf, I haven't had the opportunity to meet you in person, but I'm a big fan of your city and I've had the opportunity to visit it many times. We live near the Port of Portland, Maine, which is not as big as the Port of Oakland, which I understand is one of the biggest in the country. But my most recent trip to Oakland was actually to visit the California Clean Energy Fund, which is based in Oakland. I think it's still based there, and had the opportunity to do a tour of clean energy businesses in your city. And it was a transformational trip for me in many ways, and how we're thinking about investment in that sector here in Maine. And I won't spend too much time on your biography because I'm really dying to hear your comments, but I did just want to note, as someone who hasn't met you and hasn't followed Oakland politics or economic development very closely, just to read your bio is so inspiring, because you are really clearly a doer and have gotten so much done whether it's the 17K initiative to preserve 17,000 units of affordable housing and then create 17,000 new ones, or to create the first Department of Transportation and with a real focus on equitable outcomes, creating economic revitalization. And then I did just want to congratulate you on the Oakland Promise initiative too, which creates these $500, I don't know if baby bond is quite the correct term, but that's something that a philanthropist in Maine had done several years ago as well. And I can just speak to the value of that type of program. And so I really appreciate your leadership and the opportunity to hear from you today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Mayor Schaaf.
Oh, thank you for that warm introduction. I have to admit that I was a little curious why you were inviting the mayor of Oakland, California, to give comments before a panel about rural communities, because Oakland is definitely not rural. But I'm guessing that it is because what we have in common is neglected communities, communities that have been distanced from opportunity. And we have a moment right now as we chart an ambitious path for recovery, that we do what our new president has charged us to do, and that is build back better. I also want to start by expressing my deep gratitude to the CDFI community and the role that they have played and will continue to play in this financial recovery. The injustice and deficiencies that they pointed out and have helped correct in the PPP program is something that is important. And we have got to remember these lessons so that we do not repeat these mistakes again, and that we add more resilience and equity to our economic systems. Specifically in Oakland, our CDFIs, and shout out in particular to Working Solutions and Main Street Launch, they helped us get more than $8 million in initially philanthropic funds and later CARES Act dollars, deeply, quickly into our smallest businesses, our nonprofits, our artists, targeting our lowest income entrepreneurs of color. We could not have gotten through these difficult few months without the incredible support and leadership of our CDFI community in Oakland. So thank you so much for everything that you are doing. What I wanted to talk about today may not feel like it's that environmental, because I believe that many of us know what needs to be done to address climate change and advance environmental stewardship. But this is supposed to be about environmental justice. And the difference here, I believe, and our challenge in infusing environmental justice into this financial recovery, whether that's in rural communities or other underserved communities, is that we have to start with two things. First, to recognize and reverse systemic racism. I believe that is where we must begin. And second, to give agency, access, and authority to those who are most impacted. And I have two stories here from Oakland, California that I hope will give you some hope and inspiration that illustrate what those two concepts look like on the ground. The first is the story of Tiffany Lascano and the Lay Company Cooperative. Now, and you can bring up a slide so you can see beautiful Tiffany in person. She is a daughter of the Mariana Islands and a mom of 3. She's been making lays since she was 11 years old. It's just part of her cultural heritage. And she was in a Costco around graduation time a few years ago and stopped dead in her track to see just a whole shelf stacked with lays that had been made in Thailand and imported for sale in Oakland, where her very community is struggling. Tiffany lives in the East Oakland community of Oakland. It is a neighborhood that is home to 1/3 of all Pacific Islanders that live in our county. It's also where 68% of residents live 2 times below the federal poverty level, and almost half of households pay more than half of their income towards their housing costs. Well, Tiffany decided to found the Lay Company. It is the first Pacific Islander worker-owned cooperative in the continental United States. It's also the very first worker cooperative that is located in this very neighborhood of East Oakland. The Lay Company Cooperative was able to get going with an anchor vendor in a public institution, our own public school system. So they are the preferred lay vendor of our public schools. And they have partnered with the nonprofit Roots of Success to train all their worker owners in environmental literacy, recognizing that the lay making tradition is at its heart an ecological endeavor. Now, the Lay Company could never have gotten started. Tiffany was very low income. In fact, I met her. You talked about the Oakland Promise and the baby bond program. Her baby is one of our brilliant babies. That's how I first met her. So she was very low income. She could not have qualified for a traditional loan. Her company was started with a crowdsourced zero interest loan from Kiva US. One of the premier lenders in democratizing capital for entrepreneurs who also want to do good things in the world and are locked out of traditional financing. I highlight Kiva's lending model because I believe it is an example of recognizing and reversing systemic racism, because they intentionally lend to low-income entrepreneurs and base their lending decisions on business concept and the borrower's character. They reject requiring collateral or credit scores. Let's be clear, those with generational wealth have advantage in the traditional banking system that values collateral and credit scores. How can people who've been denied generational wealth through genocide, slavery, Jim Crow, exploitation, theft, and discrimination have their credit scores and collateral assessed equally with people who haven't? Traditional banking's system of assessing lending risk perpetuates racism. And the same can be said of traditional contracting or procurement, even in government, that also award contracts based on years of experience or require high levels of bonding. Banks and procurement officers call it risk management. We must call it injustice. Perpetuating racism in who gets access to capital and contracts is the greatest collective risk to us all. And what does Kiva's racism-reduced lending practices look like in Oakland? More than $4 million in no-interest loans have been secured by more than 800 entrepreneurs like Tiffany. And also like Tiffany, when you take racism out of the equation, 70% of these borrowers are women, 85% are people of color, and many have centered their businesses on environmentally sustainable practices. Now, the second story I want to tell you about is how environmental justice and recovery emerge when you give agency, access, and authority to those most impacted. This is the leadership team of Better Neighborhoods, Same Neighbors, a multifaceted initiative created and led by 5 community organizations and some local residents from the deepest part of that East Oakland community I was just telling you about, which is also under threat of gentrification. Now, as the city of Oakland, we gave total access and technical support to these leaders. They were entrusted with full agency and authority to design community improvements and business ventures that drew on the unique assets and needs of their own beloved community. They recognized they not only needed new affordable housing, but also a street-level health clinic. And they knew that better health in this food desert of East Oakland would need more than just a clinic. It would need cleaner air, access to nature, and sustainably produced, locally sourced produce, as well as healthier recreation and transit. In comes the Segura Land Trust. Next slide. The Segura Land Trust is an organization created by the first people of Oakland, the Ohlone. And they are using a creative instrument called a cultural easement to actually begin cultivating food in the land in deep East Oakland. See, I told you there was a reason I was on a rural panel. We have little pockets of rural, even in, gritty Oakland. So this Segura Land Trust is now purchasing a 3-acre abandoned nursery to support neighborhood residents in building out what will be the largest urban aquaponics farm and food hub in the United States. And of course, they will be working with CDFIs as part of growing that enterprise. They're also creating a 1.2-mile community trail along a creek that has long been neglected and has had no access from the public. And they're planting 2,000 trees throughout this neighborhood. And finally, another only in Oakland innovation. Next slide, our scraper bike team. They are caring for their own turf in a very only in Oakland way. These young people out of East Oakland started with some tin foil and electrical tape to actually make bike riding cool and artistic and creative. They are going to be partnering with CDFIs to expand bike share, but in a way that resonates with East Oakland youth. They're going to be creating youth development programs and job training in bike repair for East Oakland youth in a way that is so unique and only organic to this particular community. And I am so excited to share with you that this set of initiatives, these new ventures, recently won a $28 million grant from the state of California's Transformative Climate Communities Program. So friends, what I challenge us here all today is to recognize that financial recovery and environmental justice are things we can not just do together, but that we must do together. I look forward to hearing the panel. Thank you for including me today. Back to you, Keith.
Thank you, Mayor Schaaf, for those excellent comments. I just I want to say so much, but what I'll leave it at is, I think having the mayor of a city like Oakland on a panel that's largely focused on rural is really great, just to further emphasize that the connections we have with each other as Americans between rural and urban America and everything in between, from food to energy to everything. And your comments did make me think we may need to have some kind of exchange with the aquaponics company, because CEI helped launch Maine's aquaculture industry in the late 70s, and we're still involved with that industry as a CDFI, as a lender and investor and technical assistance provider. And there's a lot of interesting science now around the climate benefits of aquaculture and aquaponics. And so I think we could learn a lot from what that company's doing, and would love to share some of our shellfish and sea vegetables from here in Maine. But so I'm going to keep us moving, and the way we're going to break this out over the next 35 minutes is we have sort of two categories of questions. The first really on CDFI impact related to climate and environmental work, and then a second category really focused on advocacy and action and what we can all do to advance this work, obviously through the lens of CDFIs in this conversation. I'll give I have some questions I want to ask each panelist, and through that process, I'll let them introduce themselves briefly as I ask each question. And I'm going to start with Neda, who's the director at Inclusive, and Neda, I'll let you talk a little bit about that. But you know, I've gotten to know you through some work we're doing that's funded by the Department of Energy, and you guys are doing a ton of work on solar financing, both in actual lending and in providing training information to other CDFIs to add solar to their products. Can you talk a little bit more about that program and how businesses and organizations can incorporate these resources into their own work?
Sure, great. Thanks so much, Keith. So as Keith mentioned, I'm Director for Resiliency and Clean Energy at Inclusive, which is a national network of community development credit unions and a CDFI intermediary. And we, through our membership, our members serve over 12 million people in the low-income communities and communities of color that have been most severely impacted by both the COVID and the economic crises that we've been experiencing. So what we saw at Inclusive is that CDFIs and other community lenders are very well positioned to drive investment in resiliency and clean energy solutions such as solar products. But very few had been offering solar loan products or other green loan products. They didn't know where to start. And so to help address that gap, we launched the Inclusive Center for Resiliency and Clean Energy. Our goal is to really help community lenders drive climate-friendly investment. And Keith, as you know, you're a partner with us in this through CEI. And we're also working with in close partnership with the Center for Impact Finance at the University of New Hampshire. And through that work, we've launched a solar lending professional training and certificate program. And that's for CDFIs and community-based lenders. It's really designed to increase access to solar financing for individuals and small businesses in low-income communities and communities of color. It's a virtual training. It's led by instructors who are leaders in developing and implementing climate-friendly financing solutions for CDFIs. And it's something that if folks on this call are interested in, they're welcome to apply for the training. It's split into two tracks. We have a residential consumer solar lending track and a commercial / project finance solar track. And we really break down everything that's needed to design and build a solar loan program for your lending institution, how to do the underwriting, how to think about the product design, how to think about what your customers or members might need. And so I'll stop there. If you're interested in applying, you can look at the Inclusive Center for Resiliency and Clean Energy's website.
Thanks, Neda. And one comment I wanted to make too, you know, one other thing we have this group of panelists has in common with Mayor Schaaf is just they're all incredible doers and doing stuff on the ground and making things happen. So, Nikki, I wanted to ask you, you know, to introduce yourself and NDN Fund for all of us. But, you know, there's so many questions I have for you. But one thing that you guys are very much focused on is regenerative projects. And I'm wondering if you could tell us the work you're doing to support regenerative principles in your work, and how do those principles help achieve environmental justice?
Thank you, Keith and Anin. Mino Giji, good. Hello and good day, everyone. Yes, I'm the Indian Fund Managing Director at Indian Collective. Before I jump in, I did want to just say a quick thanks to our friend and partner at Oesta, Krista Cornelius, for sharing the opportunity to speak on this panel today. So Chimagwecha, she's out there in the virtual audience. I'll also quickly say that I did appreciate the mayor's words today, recognizing that systemic racism, environmental injustice, health inequity, that all these issues are interrelated and part of our nation's history and our present reality and practices, even in very progressive communities like ours. So, but Indian Fund was established by Indian Collective, and we're an emerging national Native CDFI, and we're looking at large scale development. So moving at least to start with 100 million in capital to large scale projects led by and serving our Indigenous communities that uphold the principles of regenerative and just economies in these key areas. So renewable energy, social enterprise, community development, affordable housing, infrastructure, so much needed roads, telecom and water all across Indian country. And so we realize that it's not right just about deal flow. We have to support projects that ultimately return the decision-making around design and deal structure and project outcomes back to Indigenous peoples. And this is universally lacking, right, in conventional finance, whose practices are still steeped in systemic racism. So as we have organizers and activists and movers and shakers in DC that work to change national policy and create paradigm shifts towards just transition and climate, at Indian Fund, we're thinking of like, how do we provide, right, the alternatives to those systems? And in order to provide those alternatives, we know that we have to rely on our ancestral knowledge as a guide to designing regenerative economies of the future, working with financial systems and technology that are expressive of those values and strengths. So we focus on innovation and adaptation. And so we've designed with many different partners, some of them on this call, some of them in the virtual audience, resilient and regenerative guidelines, capital screens, underwriting practices and evaluations that really empower new regenerative systems for abundance, impact, and equity, and for all people and planet. So I'll give really 2 quick examples of projects that we're closing here in a few weeks. They'll total around $5 million. One is a large eel aquaculture facility with the tribal enterprise in the Northeast. So this tribe has harvested elvers for thousands of years. There's a large market for these across the world for unagi. Most of it is done in China and Japan, and the current foreign sources of eels, they pose environmental, health, and ethical dilemmas. So this project is looking at doing it domestically and also supporting the tribal workforce that's long harvested these eels in a way that has an abundance of like social, cultural, environmental, and health co-benefits. And it's also lucrative. So I could say so much more about that project, but I know we're time bound. So our second is looking at a scalable commercial facility to manufacture construction blocks that upcycle styrofoam, keeping them from landfills, and then also using these blocks in the design and development of affordable tribal housing developments. So also training tribal members as contractors and subcontractors, and not to mention that the blocks that this commercial facility would develop can be used really in all construction because they are literally resilient to nearly all man-made and natural disasters. So it's incredibly amazing. We've done bridge loans to solar developments that are helping the Navajo Nation in their own just transition away from coal and providing electricity to thousands of households that are still without power. And these are just a few examples of how reimagined underwriting can support these alternative systems to extractive practices while still making money. And it's being done outside of Indian country, right? CEI is doing this, others on this call, and just appreciate those that have brought us in this circle, like Stewart, Sarkozy, Banaxi, formerly of 100 Resilient Cities, and just excited to also be a part of a group that's testing these tools to make it a market standard for all CDFIs. Chimagwich.
Thanks so much, Nikki. That's a great overview, and those are great examples. And I think I'm familiar with one of those projects, and it's just I think it's a very unique approach, and will be something that can be built on for sure. So I'm now happy to introduce Jennifer Curtis, who's the co-founder and co-CEO of First Hand Foods. And Jennifer, we're so grateful that you're here as a business owner and someone who has had to interface with a CDFI, or I shouldn't say has to, but because I know you've worked with a great one and in NCI Fund. But I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your business in North Carolina that was financed by NCI Fund, and tell us how you connected with them and how they were able to support your work.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be on this panel. And I just want to say that before I moved to North Carolina, I was living in Oakland and I miss it dearly. So it was great to be reconnected. But First Hand Foods is a women-owned food hub that sells pasture-raised local meats, pork, beef, and lamb. And we got started about 10 years ago. My business partner and I, passionate about using business as a tool for social good, and saw a lot of problems in the meat industry as one part of our broken food system. And before we got started, actually, is when we met NCI Fund. We were both doing a lot of networking with slow money circles and applying for grants and looking for ways to operationalize, writing our business plan, taking advantage of various mentorship programs that the universities offer around here. And we kept bumping into NCI Fund. And they were looking for how do they plug into these and connect with entrepreneurs wanting to start businesses. And so to me, when someone asked me to talk about how we initially connected, I thought it was actually really important that they were out looking for us. And so when a couple years later, 3 or 4 years later, when we were up and running, had moved into a larger warehouse space, they were our first choice to go to for our first ever loan to build a bigger freezer, a walk-in freezer. Here in the meat business, it's a perishable product. It has about max 2 weeks shelf life. You've got to have a longer window of time to sell it. You have to have a freezer. And we were operating in a bunch of small ones, and that was untenable at that time. So they, were great to work with, and we've been connected ever since. And so, it was an essential piece of infrastructure that we needed, that we couldn't have financed ourselves, and felt completely appropriate for a loan. And so that's how we connected.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I'm curious, how can other entrepreneurs like yourself, learn from your experience and be encouraged to incorporate, environmental principles and practice, not just principles, but actual practices into their work? And it sounds like it was very intentional for you.
Yeah, I think there's sort of no substitute for intrinsic motivation. I joke a lot that I honestly used to be a vegetarian. So it was I never thought I'd grow up and own a meat business, but I knew I would eventually be working on social and environmental justice issues in our food system. And the meat industry has a lot of problems when it comes to animal welfare, environmental stewardship, et cetera. So I started with that passion in mind. And really our whole business objective is to help small scale livestock producers thrive when the typical system is run by very, very large scale vertically integrated companies. But I guess my advice to fellow entrepreneurs who want to take on a mission-driven focus is to go in with your eyes wide open, because the longer I've been in this, the more I really see the trade-offs between a big profit motive and the mission. So I'm incredibly proud of the accomplishments we've made. We've helped, we helped 35 small-scale farmers throughout our state be in business and hold on to their farms when they might otherwise have to sell. We've helped secure 9,000 and preserve 9,000 acres of farmland for regenerative practices that help sequester soil, help build soil quality, sequester carbon, address climate change. So there's like a tremendous environmental benefit from keeping these animals raised outdoors on pasture. We've created all sorts of jobs, dozens of jobs along our supply chain, because we work with 3 or 4 different small scale meat processors in rural areas. So like just awesome social and environmental benefits that I am super excited about. But we are honestly a break-even business most of the time. And that's actually kind of remarkable in food, because food is just not something that's easy to make a big profit when you do it with integrity, and you pay your farmers fairly, and you pay your processors fairly, and everything's done on a small local scale. So to me, it speaks volumes even more to have these mission-aligned lenders and supporters and funders who are going to help these community businesses really thrive. So the more I've been in it, the more I see the need for these partnerships, because it's a big, huge food system to try to fix, and the incentive structures and the policies are very much aimed at other kinds of enterprises for the most part, the large scale commodity ones. And so anyway, I think there's trade-offs, and it's real. And you gotta, if you're going into it, you gotta say it's worth it.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. That's so great. And as I said to the mayor, I could envision another exchange here between Maine and North Carolina. 30% of CEI's loan portfolio roughly is in the ag and food industry. And we've worked with a lot of farmers and processors and distributors, and actually just ran a grant program at the end of the calendar year to deploy care funds for the state of Maine, and ended up making 450 grants, believe it or not, to food businesses to help with their transitions they had to make due to COVID. So I have so many more questions, but I'm gonna move on to you, Hannah. And I know we're not supposed to have, as parents, we're not supposed to have favorites, but after CEI, one of my favorite CDFIs is NCI Fund. And we've worked a lot together on trying to really advance this work of environmental action through our CDFI work. But I'm curious, NCI Fund works in Appalachia, and I'm curious how you guys have, if you could share with this group, how you guys have supported communities that have been impacted by, the very real energy transitions, and why CDFIs are so critical in these areas.
Thanks, Keith. I'm thrilled to hear that. And thanks, Jennifer, for being on with us today. Just quickly, I'm Hannah, and with Natural Capital Investment Fund, and I help guide our strategic initiatives, which is sort of all the work that wraps around the financing, which is really necessary when we're bringing new products to market and helping underserved communities and folks that couldn't just walk into a bank. But with regard to the energy transition, global decline in the demand for coal has devastated Appalachia, along with other communities like, in Wyoming, or native communities, as Nikki described. And in West Virginia, in Appalachia specifically, it's been devastating because the economy has really centered around the coal industry and supporting industries. Everything is centered around coal. And that's only been compounded by the effects of first the Great Recession in 2008, and now the impact of COVID-19. At Natural Capital, we're working to build a more resilient economy in Appalachia in every sense of the word. So, we're working to help our communities better able withstand both economic and natural shocks, as well as ongoing stressors, so that when one company closes or there's one flood, the whole town doesn't die, and there's not these reverberations throughout the broader state or even the regional economy. So our work is really targeted at diversifying local economies, as well as shortening and strengthening supply chains, which we've heard a little bit about today, and then strengthening individual small businesses to withstand shocks and stressors, and to support business models that also can help mitigate either climate change or the effects, just adapting to some of the effects, which we'll have to do. And furthermore, Natural Capital is promoting a just transition, which Nikki also mentioned. So this idea of a just transition to a new economy, both in the energy economy and more broadly. Appalachia in particular literally powered economic development in this country. So we can't leave those people behind, those communities behind. And the new economy broadly has to be an equitable one with opportunities for women, people of color, and under-resourced people generally. So at Natural Capital, we're doing exactly what CDFIs are supposed to do, whether that's being the first lender in an underserved market like we were in West Virginia, or bringing a new energy financing product to the table. It's our job to really catalyze necessary change.
Thank you, Hannah. So I'm going to transition us now a little bit into a conversation about advocacy and action, which is, a critical. You've each touched on action in some ways here, but Netta, can you talk a little bit about how Inclusive's, the Center for Resiliency and Clean Energy, is using its position to further the creation of an inclusive equitable recovery, especially with a focus on environmental justice for underserved and vulnerable communities.
Oh, yeah, of course. So in this morning session, President Clinton mentioned that one of the keys to driving clean energy into some of our more vulnerable communities is to answer the how questions. So the Center for Resiliency and Clean Energy is really focusing on answering the question, how can we increase access to financing and investment in clean energy in underserved and vulnerable communities? Inclusive has been working for many, many years to raise visibility and awareness of the need to invest in community credit unions, minority depository institutions, CDFIs, to really to support these communities. And we saw so many different challenges come up in 2020 that that really have now been raising awareness, and also we've seen through this huge groundbreaking $12 billion investment for CDFIs and MDI institutions through the recent COVID stimulus bill, that they're also getting real attention, real solutions are going to be possible. And so what we noticed during the pandemic is that a lot of the institutions that we work with, they were really on the front lines. They were able to leverage the PPP program and help their communities. They were serving as financial first responders. And we realized during the recovery that there is an opportunity to expand that work into solar and green lending, particularly for vulnerable communities. And so I mentioned earlier, we have our training program. A huge component of that is trying to identify what community lenders, what CDFIs and other community financial institutions need in order to make solar loans and other clean energy and energy efficiency solutions available and affordable to low-income communities. So we've really been, as part of this training, we've been designing solutions for that and working with community lenders to build kind of an infrastructure to continue to offer those solutions.
Thank you, Netta. So Jennifer, there's, many people talk about the importance of small businesses, and which are, Maine, 95% of businesses in Maine are small businesses, and they're just critical to our communities and, in many ways, the heart and soul of communities across the state. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the role that NCI Funds Capital played for your small business as well. You did talk a little bit about how your work is supporting other farmers and leading to job creation in your communities. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and sort of the benefits that go on from radiate out from your business.
Yeah, so to understand our the impacts, I think just a little tiny bit on our business model. So we're what's called an aggregator, and we buy whole animals from a network of farmers so that the farmers can farm and not worry about anything else. So we buy the whole animals, we pay small scale processors in rural communities to slaughter and fabricate the meats to our specifications, and then we bring all the meat back to our warehouse in an urban area, and then we sell to restaurants, grocery stores, home delivery businesses, caterers. We're a wholesaler, and we sell to about 100 different businesses in our community. And so from the very get-go, we are literally the connection between the rural farmers and the more urban metropolitan marketplace and set of consumers that really value these higher value meats, so to speak, and that can pay for them, honestly. So to me, we bridge that connection, and at the farm level, I think the primary benefit, we're not big enough yet. Our scope is still, we're about a $2 million business. We've been at it 10 years, and about 75% of all the revenues that we bring in go straight back out to the farmers and processors. So our costs of goods are quite high. It's part of the reason it's difficult to be more than a break-even business, because we're we're really paying way above commodity to our farmers. I mean, we negotiate pricing, which is unheard of in the meat industry. I can get into all that, but there's a lot of equity built into the way we treat each other along the supply chain, and the respect we have as partners and the trust we've built over the years. So it's an opportunity for rural, small scale farmers who would otherwise be completely shut out of these markets. They could never on their own sell to a university or sell to a corporate dining hall or be at a fancy restaurant in Durham. So, and they're not inclined to form co-ops very often. So at least in the South, this has not been something, I mean, we thought at first when we started, we would hand over our business model to a co-op of farmers, but they didn't want that. They really rather just be independent and sell to us. And so to me, we give them that opportunity to work collectively and get a bigger piece of the market than they would solo. And so it's sustaining these small scale farmers together. And then it's also employing these processors who are often, before we started working with them, all they did was slaughter deer. And now they are getting grants. Care money came in and went straight out to these processors because of the work we've done with them to give them new packaging and to adapt and address the new needs of the market. So there are these small scale processors that are adding jobs and adding infrastructure and trying to grow with this market opportunity. So, job creation. And then, I mean, to me, I started out as an environmental advocate. And so to me, I keep trying to push the envelope on what we can do with our farmers around regenerative practices. We buy from a lot of cattle ranchers, and what they do is so important for addressing climate change that I'm looking forward to opportunities to do more of that and learn about it and be able to tell that story better. I have to say we need more data on how our farmers do impact. And once I have that, I'm hopeful that I could tell that story better to the end consumer. And anyway, I digress, but I hope I kind of get at some of the impacts.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jennifer. I think those are really great points. And I think those data will be really important. And I appreciate you just highlighting the importance of that public investment has played, particularly in the past year through the CARES Act and resources like that. Nikki, since I've learned a lot from you over the past year about NDN, and you guys have done a lot of work to further advocacy efforts to support environmental justice. And I'm curious what insight or recommendations you can offer for how CDFIs can play a more active role seeking both policy changes, but also to increase climate-friendly policy and beyond climate to other resilience investments. If you could speak to that.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. And I think that's what's beautiful at Indian Collective, right? The fund is a supporting organization, so we're not just out there by ourselves like an island as a CDFI, right? Because we have a team of community organizers that are in close relationship with dozens of grassroots movements across the Indigenous world. So we're providing programmatic orientation and putting Indian and our entire ecosystem in relationship with the voices of our communities, helping them set priorities that really guide our philanthropic and investment efforts, right? And how we can also be in quick and rapid response to the needs and the changing context on the ground in these different spaces, right? Because we're on the front lines of just transition, climate justice, and our program design is really meant to create real partnerships and help steward and grow power in our communities by providing access to meaningful resources, strategic support, and also a communication strategy that's meant to amplify those stories and those narratives on the ground that also help change stereotypes. And so our president and founder, Nick Tilson, along with many in our leadership on our board, they've been deeply involved, right, in work at DAPL, at Standing Rock. We have had action teams fighting hard against the Keystone KXL pipeline and board members and partners in the Arctic Refuge. And we've been very happy that Biden's first days, right, we're canceling KXL and halting drilling in the Arctic Refuge. And we've had the privilege of being able to advise, right, the Biden and Harris team, particularly around climate issues, and really stressing the importance of free and informed consent on all future decisions on tribal lands. So not just consultation. And we're leaning into now the actions to stop Line 3, which is the Enbridge pipeline that's cutting through my homelands in northern Minnesota, as well as others' homelands. And it's not just an issue of environmental justice, it's also an issue that's around treaty rights and human rights. And we have a climate justice director, Jade Begay, and she helps coordinate this work across our entire ecosystem. So from lending to grant making to direct action, policy, and advocacy, including a really systemic and concentrated effort behind the nomination of Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior, to have a Native person in charge of land management for Indian lands. It's amazing. And we also have those that are in appointments at the Department of Energy that used to be on our board. We're very proud of that. But I would say that it's nice if you have an entire ecosystem behind you, and if you don't, then I would say get connected to an ecosystem. So there are national intermediaries for CDFIs like Opportunity Finance Network that have climate justice working groups that also advocate for local, state, and national policy changes. And those are ways to tap in and connect and support climate justice, but in a way that also makes it applicable. We can even say practical for lenders and investors, because it is. And then last, I just say, there's other groups like the Resilience 21 group of resilience officers and experts across the country's major cities that informed recommendations also around climate and resilience. And there were many tenets of that impact CDFIs in a really good way. So I would say to check out that resilience21.org, but really seeking out who those, I think, national networks are and making connections. It's worth the time, right? Because we're on brink of, what do climate scientists say? Sixth extinction. The fifth was the dinosaurs. So if people don't feel like there's a fire under them to get involved, that would totally blow my mind. So anyways, I'll pause there.
Thank you, Nikki. And I really appreciate all those comments, and just will affirm how much we all can learn from leaders in Indian country. And so you guys are doing so much. So thank you. I'm going to ask one more question to you, Hannah, before we open it up to the Q&A from the audience. But I've spent a fair bit of time with you and NCI Fund's CEO on the Hill down in DC to advocate for CDFIs. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your advocacy work with NCI Fund and why it's important for CDFIs like NCI Fund to be involved in advocacy and policy.
Yeah, of course. Happy to speak to this and get more CDFIs into this work with us. So first and foremost, we advocate for access to capital as a CDFI. It's the lifeblood of all of our work. And we're petitioning federal agencies, states, and philanthropy. I would lump them into this category as well, for flexible capital that is flexible enough to enable us to take the risks that we need to take to actually make change. So if we want different outcomes, we really need different inputs. And that means longer, cheaper investments, possibly lower short-term financial returns, but greater social and environmental returns, and maybe even long-term financial returns as well. We are advocating for the access to capital to do this work that we talked about today, but we're also promoting policies at the state and local level to pave the way for our investments and broader goals. So for example, we advocate for state tax credits to banks to make investments in CDFIs, for energy financing tools, that states and local governments have to be the ones to put in place. We even advocate for updated food safety regulations to help our borrowers be able to produce and sell more. So we get really deep sometimes into the details. And it's really important for CDFIs to take on this policy and advocacy and education work, especially in rural communities, because frankly, we are some of the few high capacity organizations in these areas equipped to do it. We have to do it. We have to do it to advance our work, and we have to do it to better serve our communities. Because ultimately, like, our mission isn't to lend more money, it's to help businesses, communities, and people succeed. So then advocacy and policy becomes part of our work too. And furthermore, you know, all of us CDFIs as an industry, we are doing great, significant work. We are having impact in the world. But if we really want to move the needle on some of these big challenges like policy, like climate change and like racial equity, we need a lot more capital to flow to the right places, and policy is going to be the thing to drive that.
Thanks, Hannah. I think those are great points, and you're also kind of highlighting Nikki's points around the network of CDFIs that we have, but also the next circle out of other, you know, if you will, adjacent networks too that we need to engage, and in many ways even like cross movement across not just our CDFI world, but the environmental movement and other movements, social movements. So I'm going to throw out a question here to any of you, and all of you could answer if you'd like, but this is from the audience, and the question is, you know, what would you say to President Biden if he was listening right now? In terms of supporting CDFIs and resilient CDFI power. So anyone can take that. Thank you, Nikki.
I'll be brief. So I'm usually long-winded, but I'll be very brief and reference again that resilience, building 21, if you, again, and ask them to say, really dig deep into looking at what those policy recommendations are, because they cover not just urban communities, but they were also, you know, vetted and made to work for the entire nation. And there's also specific things and call outs for like the US Treasury CDFI fund. So I would say, really make sure that your administration, your cabinet members and leaders are looking at that as a means for guiding the next 100 days, the next 6 months, the rest of the administration. And then I would say, always make sure that you're leaving open pathways and communications with Indigenous peoples, right? That we're not just a little focus group, or that you ask, how can we do better interfacing with tribal councils or tribal governments? It's no, we need to be in all those seats and all those hallways of power, because we really do and have had for a long time, I think, the right models and approaches.
Thanks, Nikki. I do have a recommendation, or something I would say if Hannah, Jennifer, Netta, if you don't, but.
I do.
Okay, go for it, Jennifer.
Okay, if Biden were listening, or Kamala for that matter, I would say, could we redirect the farm subsidies to support local regional food systems and CDFIs in the mix to build out the partnerships and the connections and the distribution channels for regional food. Right now, I feel like we have two different food systems: uber micro, small, local, niche, and massive global industrial. And let's build something in the middle that really serves communities. And then look for all the hidden incentives in government procurement contracts that could be removed and or replaced to incentivize purchase of local sustainable food by the government in all of its procurement, and encourage states to do the same.
Thank you, Jennifer. Those are so great. I'm going to welcome Mayor Schaaf back here. And Mayor Schaaf, I'd love your answer to this question too, because I'm sure it's even more powerful than mine, that's for sure. So if you wanted to comment, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I was snapping up Jennifer's reference to procurement. to recognize that it's time, and government has a role to play in showing the way, in leading by example. And I was trying to touch on in my examples how we're trying to rethink how we do procurement. We haven't set up systems that are friendly to small enterprises where that government contract could be the pathway to creating that mid-level food supplier that you are talking about, Jennifer. And then my other example was with that workers collective. A workers cooperative cannot be formed, at least under California corporate law, without an anchor vendor. And in this case, the government served as that anchor vendor. So I think our public systems have a huge role to play in really changing the ecosystem and taking away those barriers, which I call systemic racism. You can call it whatever you like, but I think it is really important that we accelerate that work, and that's how government can play in that space.
Thank you, Mayor Schaaf. I'll share my comment now, which is, very basic. I would, as I said in my earlier comments, there's 1,100 CDFIs in this country that are certified by the Treasury Department and who are typically tailoring their products and services to the needs of their community. So as the president, implements his Build Back Better plan and his climate plan, I would say to definitely one of the first calls he should make is to Lisa Mensa, who's the CEO of the Opportunity Finance Network, who's just a tremendous advocate for our field and for everything we're talking about today. And so I'll leave it at that. And
Keith, I would second your comments. It's exactly what I would say. I'd advocate for CDFIs generally. COVID has shown how we can be a really powerful force as organizations that are targeting their investments and are flexible. And you could apply it to rural economic development, natural resource-based sectors, or you can apply it to daycare and healthcare and broadband. So yes, I just hope that either President Biden is listening or President Clinton is listening and he'll share the message, or there's other funders listening that will start to connect with CDFIs.
Thanks, Hannah. Those are great comments. I'm just looking in the Q&A. Do folks have other questions, or Netta, did you want to weigh in on this one while we're waiting for we have a few minutes remaining, so.
Sure.
Sometime.
Yeah, I think I would echo what everyone on the panel has said, and I would add, I think in terms of clean energy and renewable energy, there's the idea that that's something meant for wealthy communities or people with high credit scores or certain profiles, and that's really not the case. There's so much opportunity to drive renewables and energy efficiency solutions into low-income communities, communities of color, and I think we've mentioned it throughout this session, but the way that we structure the financing and the types of resources that we provide to the community-based lenders can make a huge difference. They're on the ground, they're already embedded in the communities in ways that larger financial institutions are not. And so I think continuing to support that and ramping up that support would be incredibly impactful.
Thanks, Netta. One other thing I'll add, just maybe building more on some of Nikki's comments again about thinking outside of environmental justice alone, is really considering the broader social infrastructure. And as many people who know me will know, I can't leave any meeting without advocating for childcare and the importance of childcare to a strong economy, a strong recovery, and not just that, but making work accessible for more people in this country. So I know that may seem like out of left field in the conversation about environmental work, but I just think it's critical. I do have another question here. How can folks who are listening in today further the work you are all doing? And what's needed to continue supporting small businesses that are making a difference for their communities and their environment? And I'll open that up to the entire group.
I jump in and say, really challenging against systemic racism in all places, right? So there's tons of research that exists. Morgan Stanley did a report, $1 trillion blind spot. There's others that say we're asking our businesses of color and our entrepreneurs very different questions than we are asking white businesses, white entrepreneurs. It's the potential for success versus the potential for risk, and how are you mitigating it? And that is done in the private investment community, but it's also done in our federal programming. It's done at a policy level. Redlining is still here. So even if they're not like embedded in federal legislation right now, these practices are still here. So I would say the call out would be active allies, right? And especially as it relates to capital access, as it relates to human rights, health equity, educational equity. I really, again, appreciate what the mayor shared. Everything is interconnected and comes down to that. So I think just being able to call a thing, let's call a thing, and even get comfortable with it, I think is one first good step. And then investing directly into those efforts, whether they be Indigenous or other communities of color, direct program related investments, direct loans, direct federal program funds, not giving them to white-led intermediaries, right, that then distribute the funds, because less than 0.5% of philanthropic dollars hit our communities directly. And so I don't even want to know what that looks like in the private capital space. So if we and I won't even get started, Jennifer, on what that whole landscape looks like for Native farmers and ranchers, and other communities of color that are in agriculture. So just to say, let's call a thing, and then make sure that we're not perpetuating the same practices, right? You don't just have to give funds, programming, or attention to white-led organizations. We're here, we're capable, and ready to speak to these issues. Chimagwech.
Thanks, Nikki.
Yeah, we need that capital. Oh, sorry, Libby. Would you like to go next? Okay. We need that capital, more of it. It needs to look different. It needs to go to different places. It needs to do different things. I don't think we could stress that enough. But it also can't be one and done. You know, we heard from Donna Gambrell earlier today in the opening panel that you have to be with businesses for the long haul. And there's so much you need to wrap around. And again, echoing Nikki's comments around like a more holistic perspective on business development, because you know, and this also serves for the climate conversation too. You know, you can't just drop in and do one project or one piece of the community and expect a whole thriving community. So we need to make those connections between different sectors, between urban and rural, and really think about this in a little bit larger and longer terms.
Thanks, Hannah. Mayor Schaaf, I'm going to give you the last word before we go into our closing.
Well, I just want to encourage people to support courage, courage in policy making, courage in elected officials. I love how you said it, Nikki, to call a thing. And it's it's okay to say, I like talking about systemic racism, because we're not laying blame in your personal biases, not to say that that does not exist also, but people can sometimes feel more comfortable moving into these systemic changes when they suddenly see how something that we have all taken for granted as a contracting process, that we give extra points to a business that has a long track record, instead of recognizing that that track record was allowed because other entrepreneurs were completely excluded from our economy. So that basic thing of rewarding longevity and experience in providing a service, it really takes everyone to start calling out and recognizing these types of practices that we don't call racism. But to start really, and particularly people who have privilege and power, who can use that to start shining a light on how we are all losing out. Our planet is losing out. Our people are losing out by not listening to those who are at the center of these impacts. I hope that the examples I used at the beginning show that when you actually give the authority to those most impacted, environmental justice and financial recovery happen because of that empowerment. So that is what I would leave everyone. There is a role for everyone to play in this advocacy moment.
Thank you, Mayor Schaaf. And I think that's such a great way to end. And if I were just to wrap up, kind of distill 3 themes from this. I mean, one, your comments go full circle to your opening comments, Mayor Schaaf, about the importance of intentionally addressing systemic racism, and that's, CDFI is going to have an important role to play in that work. Another piece is to be intentional about our work with environmental action specifically, and Jennifer, I think that's so well highlighted in the mission of your business and the success of your business and what you're doing. And the third, more generally, going back to that question about President Biden, is the important role that CDFIs have to play in this work. So with that, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be on this panel, and it's been great to see all of you and hear all of your experiences and recommendations. And Mayor Schaaf, again, I look forward to someday getting back out to Oakland when we can do more traveling and stuff to see your city. But with that, Erica, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Keith. I really appreciated this conversation from our esteemed panel, Netta, Nikki, Jennifer, Hannah, Mayor Schaaf. It's such an honor to have you all on our panel today. And, just thank you, Keith, for leading that really informative and meaningful panel conversation. As I mentioned earlier, I really look forward to finding ways to push the work that you all are doing forward. And so if anyone would like to be connected to any of our panelists, please contact me. And I hope you can join us for the next block of breakouts happening at 2:30 and all of our future events in the CGI Action Network on Inclusive Economic Recovery. I thank you all again for joining us. To our panelists, again, thank you, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.